This
in here
conference will now be recorded. This
name,
conference will now
that
be
would be
recorded.
helpful. I see that some people have been adding uh, who they work for or what they're associated with. That's just helpful when we get into discussions. So anyway, welcome, and we'll just go ahead and jump right on in. Jessica, if you want to go ahead.
Do you want to do around the room introductions, Jamie, or just jump right into presenters?
Um, I I don't know that we need to do that every time. I think it would be helpful if people could add
Sure.
on their
Yeah.
name where they're from. And then if we
Like,
feel it's
yeah.
necessary when we get into discussions, we can always do that. I think most
Cool.
of us
Sounds good.
know each other by now. All
Yep.
right.
I think we have a few newbies, but that we'll all figure it out together. So our first presenters today are Mike Wessel and Marcus Beck. They are going to give us an update on the Habitat Master Plan an update on the Habitat Master Plan update, report card and tools. So Marcus, do I need to give you permission? Are you going to be running that?
Yes, if you can give me
Yeah, let me
permission.
find you. I think you have it now.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm presenting this cooperatively with Mike Wessel from Janicki Environmental. He and I have been working on a project for the last couple of months that is really all about making a report card for some of the products that are coming out of the Habitat Master Plan update. And so, as I understand it, the HMPU is one of the reasons this entire group exists. So we really want to make a concerted effort to have the tools that come out of the HMPU be more actionable, and that's kind of the whole motivation about this. So I'll give some background to the HMPU, what we're trying to do, and then hand it off to Mike, who will talk about some of the more important details about the report card. So, actually, when I was preparing this talk, I realized that this is the third time I've spoken to this group about the HMPU. So, I'm hoping this is a lot of review, but nonetheless, I think it's good to remind ourselves what the HMPU does and why we can use it as a tool to really inform restoration projects in our watershed. So, some of my goals for today, and implicitly Mike's goals as well, are to give a recap of the HMPU, make sure we're on the same page. So I'll talk about what it is very briefly, why we need it, and how it works. Then I'll talk about some of the existing tools that we have created after the HMPU was published in 2020. Um, Again, reminding you guys what's out there already, and then kind of set up the rationale for why we need a report card on top of some of these other products. And then I believe at the very end, we have some decision points around the report card that we would definitely like your feedback on for really kind of finalizing this tool. All right, so the HMPU, as I said, this was published last year, 2020. This is a newish paradigm that we've adopted as a program that we're calling maximizing the potential. And if you're familiar with some of the past habitat master plans that our program has put out, this is a little bit different. The previous one, the paradigm they used there was restoring the balance. And so we wanted to pick a new paradigm for this because I think it reflects some different ideas about how we're approaching habitat master plan. So it's really based on this idea of kind of identifying these existing areas that are available and ripe for restoration projects and preservation, as opposed to the older paradigm where it's really about restoring a mosaic of habitat types in different ratios. And we're not abandoning those past ideas, but I think we're improving on it by a couple different ways. So this approach really kind of took a stock of what we currently have, as well as did a retrospective analysis of trends in the past of different habitat categories to see, what is the trajectory in mangroves, or what is the trajectory in native uplands, that sort of thing. And so once we took stock of that, we were able to define appropriate targets for these different habitat types. So what do we have now? What has the trajectory been? And how can we use that to inform the creation of appropriate goals or targets moving forward in the short term and long term? And the other key piece of information that comes out of this is, like I said, these opportunity areas that are actual spatially explicit locations in our watershed where we can target for different restoration projects. So there's maps that come out of this where you can actually say, well, in my jurisdiction, I need to do these restoration projects. Where are some places I can go to do this? And this report provides some information to help inform that effort. So if you look at this report, it's a very detailed report, a lot of good stuff in there, but in the front, there's the executive summary and there's some of the key products that I think are useful for this group. And so one of the first things to think about is this table that really just shows us what is the current status of native habitats in our watershed. So this is the product that I like to call how much, what do we have right now? And so this is just a breakdown of the major habitat types that we're trying to protect in our watershed. So broken down by native habitats as well as habitats we're calling restorable. So things that could be restored to these native habitats. And we've also broken this down by different strata that we're calling based on where they are in the watershed. So going all the way from within the bay to the intertidal area and all the way up into the watershed. So it's this comprehensive whole watershed approach for tracking these habitat types. So once we know how much there is, then we need to know how far we need to go to essentially reach our goals and targets that are informed by past efforts and past trends in these different habitat categories. So this is the next important table. This is actually just part of the table. It's missing the watershed component, but I just have the subtitle and intertitle here just to fit it all on one page. But basically, what you can see here is this is where we're at now, but we've also defined these targets and goals that are kind of short-term and longer-term objectives where we want to be to ensure that we're protecting and restoring the right habitats in our watershed. And so, again, these targets and goals are informed by what's been done in the past and how land use is changing in our watershed, not just in response to development, but also things like sea level rise. And what's kind of interesting about these targets and goals is that some of them are what we're calling hold the line. In other words, we like where we're at right now. Let's try to keep that. But other ones are targets and goals that are essentially progress needed. So we need to do better. And so that's things like oyster bars or salt barrens, places where we want to make sure we have more of these habitats in the future. So this, again, is another important product, how far we need to go. But then again, as I said, another important piece that comes out of this update is spatially explicit maps that show us where we could go to meet these goals and targets. And so there's a lot of maps in the report, but these are the two most important ones in my opinion. This so-called opportunity layers, and then we have a restoration potential. So the opportunity layers are basically where are all the native habitats that are currently protected or proposed to be protected, and where are all the restorable habitats that are currently protected or proposed to be protected. And then we also have this reservation category right here, these pink layers, which is basically the coastal layer here that is sort of the part of the watershed where we think it's going to be impacted by sea level rise, and we want to treat those a little bit differently based on how we think they could change over time. So these opportunity layers are, again, where we have existing opportunities, but the other piece of this is this restoration potential. So this shows native habitats as well as restorable habitats. And so restorable habitats are places that could be restored to get them to a native habitat to help us meet these goals and targets. And so these are places like abandoned fields or other habitats that aren't currently like hard developed with pervious or impervious surfaces. And so, based on these locations, we've defined this restoration potential of these areas that could be targets of, if you're doing a restoration project, what is a particular habitat type you want to focus on. And so this potential is defined by one, is it restorable? Two, what are the soils? So, that defines whether it could be a wetland or an upland or something like that. And then a couple other things. So, these I think are actionable items that tell you where you can look and the types of habitats you could restore these locations to. In some of the past presentations I've given to this group, I talked about basically operationalizing the HMPU. So everything I just talked about was sort of what's in the main document. It's basically our approach, the theory to identifying these areas and how we define the goals and targets. But of course, we want to update this over time. The targets and goals were based on an assessment of land use essentially from 2017 from the Swiftwood layers, from the ones that they produce of land use, as well as the subtidal layers for seagrass and some of the intertidal habitats. But we know they update these layers constantly, as well as some of the natural area inventories for existing and proposed conservation lands. And so we want to take those data that are routinely updated and basically assess our progress to meeting these goals by recalculating all of the layers and current estimates of the different habitat types. And so early last year, we went through this process of basically taking all the methods from this report and coding it up and making it reproducible online so that we can drop in those new layers each time they get developed. So we know how we're doing to meet our goals and targets with the most recent data that has come out since this report has been published. So all this is online. You can go to this link here on our website. You can see, what are the current values based on the most recent data. There's summaries by the whole watershed, but there's also summaries by different jurisdictions like City of Tampa or Pinellas County. So if you're from any of those institutions, you can look at, where are the restorable lands within my realm of influence. So we thought that was another way to sort of make these projects a little more accessible to our partners that are actually doing these projects. So again, moving in the right direction, I think improving on what was in the HMPU when it was first published. But to take this a step further, we were thinking, well, we really need kind of a report card to show us how we're doing. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, what we have now, not just the report, but our ability to update the assessments is really only a snapshot of where we're at any given point in time. So we need to know like how well we're doing, not just in a snapshot, but also considering like how land has been changing within a period of time from one data layer to the more recent data layer. So we want to synthesize this to more holistically take into account those different pieces of information, how we're doing and what is the trajectory, what is the rate of change in these given habitat types. And also, we have report cards for everything else, so why not do this for the HMPU? And again, this is our attempt to make this even more actionable by synthesizing the results into more easily digestible products. So that's some of the background, and now I guess I'll hand it over to Mike, who will talk about some of the methods to getting this report card.
Thanks, Marcus. So I started working with Marcus just fairly recently and realized that, of course, he had already done 99% of the work and calculating all the numbers that really need to go into a report card. It's just really a matter of how you kind of bring it to fruition and something that's simple and easily interpretable, like TBEP's pretty much standard water quality report card. It's kind of the iconic report card that they put out, which is on the left here, which tracks seagrass and water quality conditions throughout the bays. And so we wanted to use similar concepts, and instead of being spatially explicit, as Marcus said, it's really covers the entire watershed, but it's more what we call metric specific, or whatever land use type we're characterizing, such as the uplands or the tidal marshes or the seagrass. And there are intertidal, subtidal, and supratidal categories, and so we want this report card to be applicable to all of the different categories. So this is what we're shooting for on the right, just a red, yellow, green type of scorecard. But we want it to be meaningful, and there's obviously, as you saw in Marcus's part of the presentation, there's a lot of data that goes into it. So how we synthesize all that stuff into a single report card is the challenge here. Go ahead, next slide, please. So initially, when I was thinking about this, I started thinking about, okay, well, the challenge is one report card for both targets and goals, and the targets is in this not so great graphic. The 2030 bar here is the target acreage, and the 2050 goal is represented at the 2050 line, and then the most recent land use layer that was used for this is 2020. And so we can basically establish an accrual rate necessary from the 2020 current extent to either the 2030 target or the 2050 goal, and those are the green and yellow lines respectively. But one of the things you notice is it's not the same accrual rate for the target as it is the goal, and that's okay. There was a lot of reasoning behind these targets and the goals, and really, what is a target versus a goal. It would be nice if they all lined up on the same line, and therefore the accrual rate that we needed to meet the target was the same accrual rate that we needed to meet the goal, but that's not the case. And so after talking this through a little bit, we realized that we probably need separate report cards for the targets and the goals. If you click, I think there's a little animation. Yeah, so initially I was thinking, well, if you had an accrual rate between 2020 or our most current extent and that was above the accrual rate necessary to meet our 2050 goal, then you would say, okay, that's a green. If it was between the accrual rate between the green and the yellow, the 2050 and the 2030, then you would give it a yellow. And if it was below that, then you give it a red. But it really doesn't meet all cases when you do this. There's not all cases where the 2030 target is below the 2050 goal in terms of accrual rate. And so we really just decided, well, let's break it down, keep it simple, make 2 report cards for now, start simple and then build on it from there. So next slide, please. So this is the way we went about it to begin with. We just had these 3 categories. If you look on the right, the little matrix here, and Marcus suggested this. Look, we could just ask 2 simple questions. Is the target currently met? So in 2020, for example, is the target currently met? And that's the vertical axis. And then the other question is it trending, the rate of change or the accrual rate, trending above the 2030 target? And so if we were already meeting our 2030 target and the rate of change suggested that we would continue, we would be there in 2030, then we would give it a green or a yes and code that as a 1. If it was above the target, but it was a negative slope that suggested, okay, like mangroves, they're currently above the target, but we may lose mangroves between now and 2030 at a rate that would get us below our 2030 target. And so we would give that a yellow, code it as a 0. The kicker is that there's 2 yellow categories in this in conditional matrix here, which is that if it's below the target, but it is going to meet the 2030 target, we also give that a yellow. We figure that in this case, well, you're not meeting the target, so you don't get a green, you get a yellow, even though the rate of change suggests that you might meet the 2030 target. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you calculate that rate of change too. And of course, if it's not meeting the target and it's not going to meet the 2030 target, then you give it a red. So those were the three conditions that we initially came up with. If you go to the next slide, please. We came up with an alternative definition that really only applies to this category that gives a little bit more credit to a condition in which, you know, your 2030 target is not currently met, but it's not 2030 yet, so you still have time. And if the rate of change suggests that you will meet your 2030 target, then you would give it a little bit more of a positive bent. So in this case, we would give it a light green color and code it as 0.5. And all other conditions are the same. So again, it really comes down to, you know, this rate of change and then how you calculate that. And for now, what we're doing is we are taking just the difference between the most recent year and the previous assessment. So in this case, it's the difference between 2020 and 2017. We're calculating the difference in acreage, dividing by 3. That's your annualized accrual rate, and then saying, okay, at that accrual rate, you know, do you meet your target or your goal? So I'll show you a little bit more about how this works in practice on a couple slides later. But this is what we generated for the 3-color scheme layout. So if you apply this to our 2050 goals for the intertidal category, mangrove forests, salt barrens, and salt marshes, and we could go and hindcast this, you know, back all the way to our first land use assessments, which were the comparison between 1990 and 1995. You know, these are the kind of scores that you would get. Okay, so that looks like the water quality report card, so that's kind of good. And you can really fill these boxes with any text that you want. I'll show you some different examples. These are just the scoring criteria that we used for this. If you go to the next slide. This is a comparison of how the targets and the target report card and the goal report card would compare. So if you remember, for like salt barrens, the target had a lower accrual rate than the goal. And so, you know, we can get different answers. For example, mangrove forests, you know, we're already above the goal, and we would be above the targets in 2030, but at based on the latest rate of change, you know, we may not actually make it to our 2050 goal. And so that's the difference between in 2020 between the green in the target and the yellow in the goal, and the same thing with the salt barren. So it does come up with some different answers depending upon whether you're looking at the target and the goal, and that's okay too, or at least it's okay with me. It's up to you guys. You're the subcommittee, so we'll talk about that a little later on. So if you go to the next slide, please. This is just to break down the numbers a little bit, and hopefully you guys can see this okay. But now, instead of the scoring criteria, within each of these boxes, I have on the top that first number is the current acreage, and then the below that is actually the annualized rate of change, or the accrual rate. So if you just take mangrove forests in 1995, our 2030 target is 15,300 acres. We are in 1995 below that target, okay, and we are at a rate of change that would suggest that we would actually exceed the target in 2030. But because we're not meeting the target, it still gets a yellow. Okay, this is according to the 3-color scheme. In 1999, we're actually below the target and losing acreage, so that's not good. In 2004, we were above the target already, and the rate of change was sufficient to meet the 2030 target, so that gets a green. And this is a case where we are actually above the target in 2007, but our rate of change is negative, and negative in such a way that we would end up below the 2030 target. So I just wanted to show you kind of the math on how that part works. And so you can see, the kind of the reasoning behind the scoring criteria in those cases. The rest of it's pretty self-explanatory on that part. Yeah, I mean, the salt marshes are, kind of the same. The only way you get the yellows for the salt marshes is if your accrual rate is great, would suggest that you would meet the 2030 target, because all of the actual acreages remain below, I believe, the target rate. So the next slide. So this is comparing the 3-color format and the 4-color format. So now in the 4-color format, again, we're giving a little more credence to the case where we're below the target, but our rate of change suggests that we would actually meet the 2030 target. So a lot of these yellows that would come out in the 3-color format would actually become green in the 4-color format, and that's kind of the gist of this comparison. But again, we're only comparing the rate of change between the 2 most recent surveys. And so whether you guys think that's sufficient or whether there's another way to calculate that rate of change over maybe a longer period of time or something, is something that we should probably talk a little bit about. If you go to the next slide, please. This slide is just to show you that we can actually fit all of the metrics that we have data for currently that we're able to get, which there are 9 of them that include both the intertidal and subtidal and supratidal categories, that we can actually fit them all on a single report card. It looks kind of funky because the surveys are occur in different years. So, you have surveys, for example, in 2001, where only seagrass and tidal flats occurred and no other of the metrics occurred. And so, it is a bit funky, but we could probably get around that with some gray background or something. If the idea was to have just a single report card for, all 9 of these metrics. The other thing to notice about this one is in the text box, the text now references the proportion of the target acreage that is realized for the particular land use year. So let's just go to 1990 seagrasses. We only had 62% of the 2030 target acreage, if that makes sense. Well, for tidal flats, we actually had greater than the target acreage, but our rate of change was such that we wouldn't make the 2030 target. And there's some funky numbers in here. Part of that may be historically, how the land use was classified and how really, our technology is getting better in this regard, and has definitely gotten better since the 90s. We've made some great strides in, just all the technology and interpretation. So there is some of that to consider. That's another thing to kind of consider when we're thinking about this stuff. Next slide, please. Yeah, so at this point, we're just looking for some feedback in general, things like the 3 versus 4 color format, how we calculate the rate of change, whether you guys are okay with that, other ways that we might be able to calculate this or other metrics that we could use. And then, right now we're really only using the land cover classification system. Actually, I'm not sure that's true. Marcus, you can correct me, like how do we get the we have the seagrass surveys and the oyster bars and stuff like that. But, GIPRA, we're not using GIPRA. We're not using some of the other data tools that we have. And from my perspective, I think it's going to take starting out simple and really, building this out over time and kind of also, back testing it to make sure we're actually kind of characterizing changes that are based on our habitat restoration stuff and not just changes that are due to, classification errors or whatever. So that's all I have.
Hey, this is Tom Reese. Mike, I just had a question. You guys have the 9 categories. I was surprised that you're not tracking the herbaceous freshwater systems, because those are disproportionately lost more in all the subbasins of this watershed. And I'm sure that you could add that in. I think it'd be important to track that too, because that has more disproportional impacts than the forested freshwater.
Yeah, I mean, this was really to develop the method. We can expand it to, whatever categories we have data for. I can't speak to exactly why that's not currently included, but it's really just, this is really just developing the methods more than anything else. Once we're confident that we, have the method down, we can apply it to any of the metrics.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, this is Brandon Johnson. Can you guys hear me?
Yes. When anybody speaks, can you just make sure that you also let us know where you're from or who you're working with, please?
Sure, this is Brandon Johnson with Stantec. Mike, how does, and maybe you covered this, I might have missed it, but I think we all have spoken on it before about with sea level rise, a lot of our immediate coastal habitats are going to be transitioning, that mangroves are going to continue to dominate and overtake some of the marsh and salt bearing areas as sea level rises. How has that essentially that natural attenuation of particularly that habitat, but just that change, how is that addressed in these calculations?
It's not addressed in the calculation. Was addressed in the target and goal setting process. But as far as I know, we're just using the data. So, the data comes out and, we're calculating the losses or gains and just applying those to the report card. It is like a lot of other trend tests or whatever. It tells you the what, it doesn't really tell you the why. And I think the why is like the next step, in terms of that. And Marcus and I have talked a little bit about some kind of, you know, algorithm or whatever to kind of decision tree or something like that to kind of go down that road. But again, this is really just taking the data and developing the report card.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that too. I mean, Mike's absolutely right that the goals and targets are meant to account for anticipated effects of things like sea level rise on the loss of these intertidal habitats in that coastal margin. And that was actually one of the main motivations for updating the HMPU was to account for those, because the past paradigms that we used didn't consider climate change as something that we need to consider when we're planning for restoration. If you look at the maps I showed earlier, and this isn't really about the report card, but the opportunity map has this pink category, and that is the coastal margin that we're calling the reservation areas that we need to think about differently. This is basically the area from the main low watermark to the 5-foot contour on the land that is most expected to be affected by sea level rise. And so we're treating those as kind of a separate category when we're thinking about opportunities in the watershed. So again, it's implicit in the HMPU. It's just not necessarily a part of this report card, other than the fact that the goals and targets we're shooting for, that the colors are based off of, account for that implicitly. And if Doug Robeson's on, I'm sure he could talk more about sort of the ideas behind, how we incorporated sea level rise into this, but it's definitely part of it.
Hey, Marcus, this is Doug. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yeah,
just a couple comments on that. If it is true, we did consider some of the HEM model runs and what would happen if you did nothing. Because if you do nothing, sea level rise is exerting a pretty big influence on the mix of at least tidal habitats and maybe also oligohaline, not so much freshwater. But so the targets were developed in a sense. It is maximizing the opportunity, but also somewhat of a throwback to restoring the balance, in that we want to acknowledge that salt marsh habitats are uniquely different than mangroves, and there should be some representation of salt marshes in the system. And even though nature is trying to push them upstream and sort of out of the mix, we have the ability to control that to some extent with MFLs that address freshwater inputs to the systems that still support marshes. And so the target, so to kind of answer the question, the targets do reflect, to some extent, the desire to keep the diversity of habitats, and recognizes that we have headwinds with regard to sea level rise and the tropicalization of Tampa Bay into a completely mangrove dominated system. So cool stuff that you're doing with the report card. That's actually a recommendation in the HMPU to do exactly what you're doing here. And Mike, I look forward to talking to you offline about some ideas of how to tweak this a little bit.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Marcus.
Yeah, Doug, it's not a coincidence that we're working on this report card now.
I know.
I do want to say though that, I mean, we are looking to the group for feedback on these things. The colors we use, how we're calculating the change rates, other things to consider. Unless we get explicit feedback from you guys, we're just going to do what we think is best, and so now's your chance to provide that input if you think like there's a way to do this better.
Marcus, can you see the chat?
Yes.
There's two different inputs there.
Mark Schramek, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
Hey, Marcus, I assume you can hear me. I don't know if you can see me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So again, Mark Schramek, NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service. As you're probably aware, there's an ongoing study by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for Tampa maintenance dredging activities. I think you might see me. Anyhow, so there's an ongoing study by the Jacksonville District Army Corps of Engineers, and it's my understanding there's going to be a significant amount of volume of dredged materials coming out of all of the channels. And there are opportunities for beneficial use or DU activities throughout Tampa Bay. I'm just thinking out loud. I think this the Habitat Master Plan might actually be helpful looking ahead down the road 5, 10, 15, 20 years, perhaps even with regard to sea level rise, in identifying candidate areas that we think might be suitable for kind of the seagrasses of tomorrow. You mentioned, I heard a mention, I think Mike had mentioned about oyster reefs. So I think that's one potential habitat area that might be considered. I just think this is a useful tool, and I think maybe it would help inform the larger discussions, when we go back to the table with the Corps of Engineers. Just wondering if other folks in the consortium have thoughts on that as well. Thanks.
So I can take a stab at it if no one else wants to offer thoughts. So when we think about the subtitle habitats that are categorized in the HMPU, it's oyster bars, seagrasses, hard bottom, and artificial reefs. So we don't have a necessary or like a map that identifies opportunity areas for these, because there's different regulations in the bay versus outside of the bay, and so we can't necessarily pursue the same types of projects as we would on the land as we would in the bay. But if there's opportunities to use spoil materials for other beneficial uses for creating habitats, like I don't know how that would work in the bay, but if there's an opportunity to help us meet these goals, then it's definitely open for discussion about how that could be done. I mean, I'm not the one to answer that question, but certainly, we're always open for discussing ideas of how we can make better use of some of the tools at our disposal.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, me
Right.
personally, I'm sorry, I do find it useful. I'll keep it in mind as conversations continue with the Corps of Engineers on that. Again, one careful consideration that we need to definitely factor in a lot of this is the sea level rise component, and I think there could be opportunities for both beneficial use that would benefit important coastal habitats as well as coastal resiliency considerations. Anyhow, that's all I've got on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Tom with ESA. I just wanted to echo what Mark was saying. If we can do some thin layer placement on some of the fringing wetlands, maybe that's one of the beneficial uses in the right location to get those marshes a little higher so they don't just get drowned out as quickly. Just a thought.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Marcus, there is a comment. I don't think it needs discussion, but it is related to the color format in there. So just for the sake of time, I think we'll go ahead and pause on any discussions. We could save it to the end. I do want to bring up our next presenter. Scott Latassi is from SwiftMud, and he's going to be giving us a little bit of information on our cooperative funding initiative program. And take it away, Scott.
All right, thanks, Jamie. I just need someone to make me presenter, and I'll share my presentation.
Cool. Let me do that real quick, Scott.
Okay, thank you.
Trying to find you in this list. All right, you should have the ability to present.
All right, do you see my screen now?
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Latassi. I'm the Engineering and Project Management Bureau Chief here at the district. We lead the Cooperative Funding Initiative in our bureau. Unfortunately, our CFI lead, Kevin Wills, is not here today. He's out sick, so I'm pinch hitting for him today. So hopefully I'll do just as good a job as he would. But we're going to go over some of the most recent changes to the program and let you know where all the great resources that we have about our cooperative funding initiative. Today, there will be a number of items I'm going to cover that are associated with changes to the program based on our CFI policy update. And then just for folks that have not worked in cooperative funding initiative, the district has a website just dedicated to cooperative funding, and there's a lot of resources there. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about today, the policy, the guidelines, how to fill out an application, it's all on the district's website. So if you have any questions at any time afterwards where you're interested about a particular resource or looking for something, feel free to reach out to me. Kevin Wills, like I said, is the CFI lead, or Rita Herod, who is our CFI administrator that helps you with applications as you get closer to the deadline. So officially, we kicked off our cooperative funding initiative back here on August 4th when we went live and had a cooperative funding workshop on the 5th. When the application went live, you were able to provide additional all the functions that allowed us to submit the applications and all the resources that were needed. The application deadline this year is going to be October 7th at 5 p.m., which marks the beginning of our internal evaluation process. So staff will be working with our cooperators as we get those applications into review, make sure that we have all the information from our cooperators, and then help evaluate these projects so they can be presented to our regional subcommittees and our board in February and April. We've historically presented these projects at a regional subcommittee level, but this year when we updated the CFI policy, we gave some latitude to where the board members can make a decision on whether they would like to have that presented differently. So they'll probably be talking about that at the December governing board meeting when we present the applications that we receive in October. So we may be going to a full governing board workshop that would include evaluation and review of all applications. But as of right now, we're still planning to do them as regional subcommittees unless our board decides differently. In September, the governing board approves the final budget. So as part of this CFI process that we start, in October of 2022, final decisions of the budget won't occur until September of 2023. So just something to be aware of. It is a lengthy process to get funding, but we're asking again for our applications starting now all the way through October 7th for this funding cycle. So I talked about, some of the changes to the CFI policy. I want to go over those major items so that you're aware of it and you can dive in a little bit deeper by looking at the policy or asking questions today or at a later date. And, during the July governing board meeting, the board approved all these revisions to the CFI policy. And the major items I wanted to cover here today was we're now requiring our cooperators to provide preliminary design plans at the time of application for any construction projects. We're looking for, additional, information at the time of application, so we have a better sense of truly what the project is, making sure that there's been additional information and work done prior to getting these applications. We're going to require cooperator-led third-party reviews. We have been doing district-led third-party reviews for those projects that are over $5 million for construction. And now we're going to be requiring the cooperators to do those third-party reviews and make that as part of the application process. So if the project is over $5 million in construction, we're looking for a preliminary design set and a third-party review being completed at the time of application. Third item I wanted to cover was our septic conversion projects. There's certain requirements that we've added when we first started providing funding for these type of projects. They never really were in the policy, so this is an update. We've made it official that it is in the policy and it is a requirement. We've also refined some of the language for our requirements for alternative water supply projects. And so that language has now been updated, as well as providing some clarification on the execution authority for our cooperative funding agreements. So the governing board allows our executive staff to execute those agreements. We wanted to make sure that the language was adjusted so that we can do so. And then really with these policy changes, we're really looking for, better information at the time of the application, and hopefully that will, give us a better understanding of the scope and the budget of these projects so we can kind of minimize change. And then, all these, the updated policy is on the CFI website as along with a lot of other resources. And one of those major resources that applicants refer to is the CFI guidelines. And so this was updated this year, and I just wanted to highlight a few of these updates. So as I talked about, this definition of a preliminary design, this new terminology, we spell out exactly what we're looking for the requirements of a preliminary design, as well as a third-party review. For anyone who has done a design construction project that's requiring a third-party review, those standards really have not changed much. We're just now really putting that a front of the application process, making sure that we have preliminary designs and a vetted design through a third-party review if those projects are over $5 million. One of the other things that we've added to the guidelines and in discussions with our cooperators that I've seen a lot of delays in our design process, and one of the things that we've done here to updating the guidelines is to allow for our cooperators to have up to 10% of the total project cost as part of a match for design, permitting, and third-party review services. So if a project is approved, we'll allow cooperators to use those design services as part of their match. And another revision to our CFI guidelines eliminates district reimbursement for any project cost increases. So we're going to continue to hold to our cooperative funding agreements, which requires the cooperators to be 100% responsible for the project cost increases. But we did have provisions in our guidelines previously for up to 10 or 20% cost increases. But since then, and working with the board, we are not allowing for project cost increases as part of our CFI guidelines. And then really what that says is that when we do an evaluation, staff will not be evaluating or recommending any cost increases to the board. The other thing that's been updated in the guidelines is really a definition of a number of the different type of projects that we have funded. So we expanded a little bit more of the definitions to help clarify some of the questions we've got in previous years. And as always, this reference documents, this guideline is out on the CFI webpage. So let me just highlight a little bit. Like I talked a little bit about, kind of clarifying things or questions we've had in the past. One of the things that we've updated in the guidelines is that for our watershed management plans, our flood protection projects, we've really encouraged our cooperators to submit the updated flood insurance rate, the information that we're doing from the watershed management plans to FEMA for these flood insurance rate map updates. We're wanting the data that is being developed as part of these projects to truly be utilized in the ultimate result of these studies is to get them in those flood insurance rate maps. In terms of water quality, we're looking at cost effectiveness, and one of those items that we've looked at over the years is, should we set a threshold for the annual amount of total nitrogen removed on projects? And so we've set a threshold of any project that provides less than 50 pounds of annual total nitrogen removal will not be recommended by staff. In terms of the natural system projects, one of the changes is we want to be clear on who the landowner is on these projects. And so we're requiring the landowner to be the applicant or the co-applicant on the CFI project. And then lastly, on natural systems, I think this will be most important to this group, is staff will not be recommending shoreline restoration projects of less than 400 feet. So now moving on from really the process to kind of the updates of our program, here's the areas in which the district will fund. And these are outlined in detail in the application guidelines, but projects that are associated really with capital project construction are things that will be funding in those 4 areas of responsibility that the district has. Like I talked about, the septic conversion projects in the northern watershed are types of projects we will fund. Data collection and research are also those type of projects that we'll be funding. Some of the things that we do not fund are associated with operation and maintenance. So we don't fund projects that are directly related to operation and maintenance. Also, those things that are really renewal or replacement of infrastructure. We're not going to be looking at projects that are to address permit violations or any type of credit generation. Other things that will not be interested in paying for reimbursement or funding is associated with recreational improvements. Of course, we've had projects where there have been recreational infrastructure added by our cooperators, but those are not reimbursable items as part of this program. And other things such as contamination cleanup and dredging for navigation are other items that we would not fund. So last year, we implemented a scoring system. We used to rank all of our projects as high, medium, and low. We went through the process of developing this scoring system so that we help differentiate our projects from just a high, medium, and low bucket of projects. And now we'll actually be able to prioritize projects by scoring. And so the evaluation that we did this past year got us a good differentiation of projects and allowed us to be able to make more difficult decisions as budgets and funding becomes more tighter that we've been talking about over the last few years. And so this system is allowing us to do that, help us make these more difficult decisions, which I'll get into in a few minutes here. And again, not just project pipe, but also some of the other requirements that will now allow a project to be recommended is associated with not meeting our CFI policies, either not meeting the guidelines, and also, we're looking for that alignment with our strategic plan. So if it doesn't align, we'll recommend the projects. And then for projects, we're looking for expenditures to occur in that fiscal year, not later on. We're trying to fund as we go year in, year out. And then also those projects that aren't cost effective or have a very low project benefit, we're not going to be recommending those. So again, I talked about the resources that are out there. There's 3 ones that you need to be familiar with if you're interested in applying for cooperative funding. That is the governing board policy that was just updated, the CFI application guidelines that I've talked about, and then lastly, there's an application user guide. So in terms of the software that is utilized to apply, there's steps along there and information that you need to fill out to be able to submit those applications. So we have a user guide to be able to help you walk step by step through the process. And if you have questions, sometimes it's best to reach out to a subject matter expert. And so we have a number of folks here at the district. Again, this slide, this whole full presentation that we shared during the CFI workshop is available at the CFI website, and it has this list as well as in the guidelines, all the people that are the experts here at the district that would be more than willing to have conversations about your upcoming projects and see if cooperative funding initiative is a good fit for your project. And then really lastly, I just want to kind of go over, the state of the fiscal year 2024 funding. If you've been paying attention to our board meetings and some of the workshops we've had over the last few years, there's a real focus on prioritizing alternative water supply. And so, we'll be funding with our regional water supply authorities approximately $600 million over the next 6 to 8 years to meet those water demands that we have in the region. And our next priority in funding after we look at an alternative water supply is those projects that are multi-year funded projects, those projects that have already been approved and the cooperators are coming in for 2nd or 3rd year of funding. We then prioritize those projects. So based on that information of these alternative water supply projects that we're committing to, these multi-year funded projects that we've committed to, we're going to have a limited amount of funding for new CFI projects, and so we anticipate over the next 6 years we're going to have about $2 to $5 million available for new projects. So one thing to note here is that the district is pursuing significant state funding to apply towards those additional fiscal year 24 projects. So if we are successful in getting some of the state or federal funds, we'll be able to offset some of that funding to be able to fund more new cooperative funding initiative projects. We won't be knowing any of that probably until late spring, so we are encouraging all of our cooperators to still submit applications, even knowing that this is going to be a competitive year when it comes to cooperative funding. And just, really lastly, I wanted to hit on that, there's a lot of different opportunities for funding out there right now, both at the state and the federal level. And so knowing that things are going to be a little bit more competitive for cooperative funding in fiscal year 24, so to make sure that everyone is taking advantage of those opportunities that are out there. And a lot of the funding we all know is coming through Resiliency Florida. So there's great grant opportunities. So look into that and see if your projects might qualify for funding there. And with that, I'll open up for any questions or comments that anyone may have. And thank you so much, Jessica, for putting the link there in the chat. And I'll be happy to answer any other questions or comments that folks have.
Thank you so much, Scott. So I just wanted to reiterate, because I think for a lot of the folks here, some of the important points would be changes this year. You mentioned shoreline restoration. Now it's going to have to be 400 feet or greater. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, that's correct. And so,
Okay,
it comes down to that, the minimum number of uh, amounts, like we're talking about, the total nitrogen removed. We're looking at the linear feet,
sure.
really looking for more of those intermediate regional type of projects, a little bit larger scale, so they are cost effective. So I think that's some of the changes there what we made for CFI is to kind of hit that minimum and start thinking more, intermediate and regional type of projects.
Sure. And then just the other one of note, now we'll be looking for projects where the design is already completed. We won't be accepting ones that uh, don't have the design yet. Is that correct?
So for the design, we're really just looking for a preliminary design. So
Okay.
some
So it could be
folks,
conceptual.
yeah, so they may call it, depending on, the type of project and, what your background is as, maybe as an engineer, whether that's 15 or 30%, just look at, the criteria that's in the CFI guidelines, and you'll see those bullet points that really kind of need to be met to show, oh yeah, that does qualify as a preliminary design. So we tried to get away from a percent design and focus more on, hey, meet these bullet points. That's what's going to qualify as a preliminary design. So yeah, do need to have preliminary design, good schedule and cost estimates so that we can review the project and make a decision.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Um, if anybody has any other questions, or we'll go ahead and, you can always email um, Scott, and then I think he showed the experts on there, so we can always post that. And otherwise, Doug, did you want to introduce your buddy Tom? Going once, going twice.
Oh,
Okay.
hey.
Ah.
Yeah.
All right, there we go.
Tom is in the office next to mine here, and he's going to talk about the concept that was raised at the last meeting regarding major projects in the Bay and linking mitigation to habitat restoration targets. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Appreciate that. Well, I just wanted to say this whole habitat restoration consortium idea did come about from the HMPU and also was noted in the habitat restoration manual. And so this is great that we have this group because there's a lot of folks on this call that are in tune with what's going on in this region, as far as unavoidable wetland impacts, projects that are coming down the pipeline. And so it's good to have as many ears in here to just talk about this concept. I'm going to start off by saying what I'm going to talk about is not really directly linking mitigation and restoration, or somehow restoration is going to help mitigation projects. It's more helping folks that have unavoidable impacts find the best place to put them in from this group. This group knows the Bay very well, and maybe we can help guide some mitigation so that it ends up helping us get our targets. Now, we heard from Marcus and Mike, how we're tracking this stuff. And so that's really important. We want to make sure we're making these targets or trying to get there. But who's doing all this, right? Well, the SWIM programs probably does the most of it, but DEP and FWC and others are actively out there doing habitat restoration projects. As we're sitting here today, as we're talking right now, there are unavoidable wetland impacts happening, right? There's developments happening every day here. Roads are being widened. So there's these projects that are going on that while we're trying to get goals, there are wetland impacts happening. And although there's mitigation required, it doesn't necessarily happen in the right spot where the impacts are. And so if you go to the next slide, please, what I wanted to really talk about is right now, if you have unavoidable wetland impacts, your options are mitigation banks. The regulatory agencies like those. We want to use those. And what we're talking about today is not, I'm going to repeat, not trying to avoid going to banks. If you have a bank in that area for the right habitat, then that's where you should go. Okay, that's the tried and true method. That's what we're using these days. But if there's no bank in your ERP basin, which we'll talk about in a minute, then you only have two other choices. You can do on-site mitigation if you have room, or you can maybe find off-site mitigation. Either way, you're doing mitigation. You have to replace for the loss and function of the wetlands that you're impacting. So next slide, please. So for those of us that do this all the time, you know, this is how that whole process works. They have these ERP basins. And so if you have an impact in one of those basins and there's a mitigation bank in that basin, then that's where you go to, right? And it's kind of proximal to the impacts in some cases. But the bottom line is that's where you go to. So it's hard to read on this map here, but if the Tampa Bay, which is number 3, that gold color on the west side includes Pinellas County and most of Hillsborough and Pasco County, that has a lot of area that's sitting on the bay. And so does the area 4, 5, 6, 7, and even a little bit of the southern coastal right there at the mouth of Tampa Bay. So that any of those ERP basins has an impact on the bay and can be a solution to some of our goal setting objectives. So there are big entities out here that do mitigation regularly. Because they have unavoidable impacts. The DOT, right? They have to widen the road where it's congested and there are typical wetlands in the way, right? Also ports, Seaport Manatee or Port Tampa Bay. These are big industries that need room, and if that's where the ships are coming in and that's where the depth is, well, that's where they have to make make their progress work. And as far as getting bigger berths and extra berths, so they have unavoidable impacts, and so they have to mitigate just like everybody else does. And so I'm not going to pick on any one of these, and I'm not trying to say there's a problem with this. I'm just saying that these entities are doing that sort of work. And so I think one of these slides got switched, so can you go to the next slide, please? So here are the examples of some of the bigger entities that have unavoidable impacts and routinely have some of the most impacts in the region. And the DOT is usually the highest on this list. And for many years, one of the ports might not need it, but when they do, they're not asking for just a couple acres. It's usually a big impact. So I want to go to look, just throw an example out there of a way that maybe this group could help guide some of this mitigation. So next slide, please. So we'll just pick a project, and we're going to pick Port Manatee just because it has relevance, and you'll see here in a minute. So you see the port in this image here in the central part. You know, it's a big industrial type of situation. You can tell that all that was made over the years. You know, that's not the natural land, but that's what you need with the port. On the right-hand side, or in the southern portion of this picture, you can see a little circle, and that's Peanut Lake. That's this old swim restoration project that they did with DEP. So on those areas where the port really has no room to expand, the port has been really gracious and opened up their ports and allowed habitat restoration to occur on their lands, and that helps get some of our goals. But if the port was going to expand in this example here, in the future, it's probably going to have some wetland impacts. And yes, if there is a bank here, they should go to it. The problem with the banks is there are banks in this area, but do they have freshwater and saltwater credits, and do they have herbaceous and forested? So although there are banks in some of these ERP basins, some of them are not working because they only have forested left, or they don't have it the right salinity, or they only have state credits instead of federal credits, and you need both credits. And so if Port Manatee had no mitigation option, they would have to try and do something somewhere. And so they could find a place, either offsite, and they would create it, they would go through permitting, and eventually satisfy their needs. The point I'm trying to make is here, we could work with the port or the DOTs and say, hey, let's see what you have coming down the pike. Where are there no banks? Let's help you find mitigation locations. And that can be maybe buy this piece of property, because they can do that, especially DOT can buy a piece of property and then turn it into mitigation. So we can help direct where these are going to be put in. And so when you talk about this stuff, you got to understand it's pretty complicated how you do the mitigation as far as where is it and how it gets scored. So next slide, please. So we're going to look on the area north of Port Manatee. That's Piney Point right here. On the left side is owned by the port, and on the right side is Swiftmud property, that actually Rock Ponds project. Next slide, please. Now this is an aerial view of the southern portion of Rock Ponds. And on the right, on that straight line, on the right to the south, especially in the bottom corner, that the port owns that corner down there. And when we were designing Rock Ponds, we were trying to find a way of connecting it. Right now it's connected through a small ditch, mosquito ditch, and so there's no really tidal flux in here. Well, the tide might drop 3 feet on it in a given day. It maybe drops about 8 inches in here because the time lag for it to go out that ditch. We were working with the port, and they were willing to work with us to make a connection along their property line, but it just wasn't quite big enough. So if the port needed to do mitigation, and they could do it on this corner right here where Rock Ponds is, and improve the hydrology, that really helps them in their scoring. Now, anybody doing mitigation and they site it next to a preserve, that gives you extra scores. So go to the next slide, please. So it doesn't matter, you would get extra scores because you're right next to a preserve. And so that gives you slightly higher UMAM scores, which is a benefit to the entity that has to have this mitigation scored and doing the mitigation. But if you happen to do the Rock Pond project, not only would you be proximal to a preserve, but if you could improve the hydrology, you would be improving about a 40-acre area of water environment. So this gets really complicated with UMAM. I'm not going to get into all what this is all about, because it's very subjective. You know, what's the landscape support of an area that gets impacted? What's the water environment? What's the community structure? And then you do the same thing for your potential mitigation. But when you're looking on your functional gains, on your mitigation side, the proximity to preserves and improving the water quality and the ecological value, and of course viability all come into play. So if the port did that, and this is a made up example here, they would not only get the extra higher scores for being proximal, but they would get the extra water quality improvements because they're improving the water quality within the restoration project that we couldn't do just because it was not enough room to do it in the initial design. And on the last slide, I just want to sum this up by just saying that what I was hoping we could do as a group is provide this sort of guidance, you know, help these big wetland impactors that are unavoidable, but still are happening, help them find mitigation when there's no bank available. Again, only when there's no bank available, and there are many instances where that happens, this group could say, hey, we need certain type of wetlands up here. If we could buy this small piece of property, or there is a small piece of property out there that's public, they could go in there and do their mitigation there, get higher scores for them. But more importantly, it's you know, filling a critical link or providing a very rare habitat that we would like to get done. I just want to emphasize again, this is not to make it easier for somebody to impact wetlands. You have to avoid first, right, before they even talk about mitigation. Mitigation's happening. Let's see if we can guide it. And so that's just a summation of this. What I would love to see, if the group thought this had some value, we could talk to these entities and look at the long-range plans and help them identify locations and even designs that meet our goals, and so that we can get better chance than just relying on swim programs and other programs like that. That's going to take a lot for them to meet some of these lofty goals, especially in light of the changes that we anticipate happening on the Bay. So I blasted through this. I just wanted to present this and why we thought that might be worthy of getting people involved behind it. So I will stop talking and take any questions or criticism.
Tom, I think that's a really interesting concept. It's certainly it's something that the last two master plan updates addressed, is making the linkages between, large scale primarily public sector projects that have unavoidable impacts, and then directing mitigation in a way that helps us meet our Baywide and watershed targets. So, this is a concept that has been out there. I guess I would ask you, what's the next step? I guess first we want to get some feedback from the group. Is this something we want to wade into? Because I know that there were some thoughts that we shouldn't be talking about mitigation in this group. I don't think we're really talking about mitigation. We're talking about linking it towards making our targets more attainable. But if the group did want to go forward, what would be the next steps in your mind?
Well, I'd like to see what people think, but the next steps would be to actually invite Port, Manatee and Tampa Port, and the DOT, District 1 and District 7, both, to come to meetings and say, look, I know you guys have long range plans. Let's talk about what you have coming up. Let's see if there's even a mitigation bank that meets those needs. If there is not, then let's see if we can help. And if there is, that's what they should do. Go to the mitigation bank. We're not here to try and take business away from that industry. We're just trying to direct it to, help our goals. So I think that would be a next step. Just invite those folks to a meeting. Let's talk with them and see which one we can help, if at all.
Tom, I'm curious, do they participate in these meetings as is? Because these are public meetings. I'm curious, they are invited already. So is there like a hindrance there as to why, they're not participating already? Is it that they're unsure, if they're welcome, or they're unsure like how to interact with the HRC? Obviously we want everybody. It takes a big tent to make the big things happen. So I'm curious if you have any insight into that.
No, and I would just guess, we're all busy, right? We're all busy. They know these meetings are here.
Right.
We've had folks join and listen in, but if it's not impacting them, that's not going to be the first thing. But if we invite them and say, look, we think we may have some solutions to help your long-range planning for unavoidable impacts, and get a representative in at any particular meeting for one or all these entities, I think we would get more participation, because it benefits them to find mitigation where there isn't any. And if we can find something that actually helps their scoring, then that lowers their costs a little bit. But that's not our objective. Our objective is to get the right type habitat in the critical places in the bay. So I would invite them directly, talk to the Chris Coolies and the folks that are in that entity that knows what's coming on and understands this process, and then see what they have coming.
Well, this is Joel Johnson from the Florida Department of Transportation District 7 in Tampa. We make up the 5-county district between starting Tampa going north to Citrus. This is actually something, and I know I've heard you mention this before too, Tom, but that I've been asking for a while from the estuary program. It sounds like what you're describing, Tom, and why it would be different than this consortium. It sounds like you're talking about some kind of ad hoc group. Basically, we would certainly be interested in that. We have a number of basins where we have challenges, and we're normally limited based on both particularly since the Water Management District, Southwest Florida, and the DOT withdrew from the Senate bill program. We're particularly challenged in a number of basins that our options are normally limited by the regulations over how we provide mitigation. And right now, it either has to be provided by private mitigation bank or in lieu fee. For in lieu fee, we need cooperators. And in the Tampa Bay area, it's been hard pressed to come by with cooperators for the Department of Transportation's needs. So I think it's a great idea to prioritize. We normally, most of our impacts come from low quality degraded wetlands that are sitting alongside a roadway or have historical impacts in urbanized corridors. To me, there's just a cooperative opportunity there that could serve great benefit to the Bay Area. But to this point, the estuary program, when I've mentioned it, Ed and Maya have mentioned that they don't want to get involved in any regulatory frameworks. So that's been the challenge, Tom. And I think if we did, whether it was through regulatory or through setting up a cooperative that of willing landowners and willing buyers, I think that's a great idea.
So would this, Tom and then Joel, would this be something where we would have like Joel recommended, a smaller focus group? There are a diverse amount of people on this meeting today. I'm not sure of everybody's interest, and it's definitely going to take a little bit more, I think, investigative work and teamwork as well, versus just presentations and sharing ideas and things like that. So do you guys both have some guidance on that?
Well, I think an ad hoc committee, for those who are interested, anybody from the TAC or anybody from this group could join and be part of it. But really, it's you roll up your sleeves and find out some of these. Some will go nowhere, right? But if we don't try, we're not going to ever have an opportunity. So I think it's worth the time, and some of them will work. And I think when they do work, it will, it could really make a difference on both sides.
Okay. Mark has a comment.
Tom, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Mark Schranek, NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service. So generally speaking, as you know, our agency is an advisory agency in the federal regulatory arena. We work primarily through the Army Corps of Engineers wetland permits, but any number of other federal entities as well. My division's responsibility is to provide science-based, sound science conservation recommendations designed to protect what's designated as essential fish habitat under the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. However, under the 2008 mitigation rule that was developed, and you're certainly aware of this, the EPA and Corps of Engineers, they've tiered mitigation pretty much to include mitigation banking initially, in lieu fees, and then last in that process would be permittee responsible mitigation, which is what it sounds like you're suggesting through these discussions. I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea. I don't know that we want to spend a whole lot of time and effort necessarily reinventing the wheel when we do have federally approved and state approved mitigation banks in Tampa Bay. However, that being said, for large scale, particularly port expansion projects, typically the breadth of impacts from those types of activities often would exceed the available credit balance that's available through these permitted banks. So while I do think, the 2008 mitigation rules, at least in the federal arena, certainly make it clear as to what the guidelines are for tiered mitigation, if you will. I think maybe having a subset of subject matter experts or folks that are involved in the state and federal permitting arenas might be useful. Do be advised, currently the Corps of Engineers hosts what are called IRTs, interagency review teams, and this could perhaps be a spinoff from that. When you showed that map, I think, of the ERP areas, to me, that seems different from the service areas that are established within federal mitigation banks. So again, one is a state permitting entity, the other is the federal permitting entity, and again, I work in the federal permitting arena. I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea. I do think that, being proactive, involved with other science-based entities has potential. I just do caution that the 2008 mitigation rule, again, by the EPA and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, already has guidelines as to the sequencing of mitigation, if you will. But if you're looking to form a subcommittee, certainly you can add my name to the list. Thanks.
Thank you. It looks like we've got Brandon Johnston from Stantec. His hand is raised.
Yeah, Tom, I think during the last meeting when you raised this topic, we had a good discussion. I think we pointed out that not just the entities that may be having these impacts need to be, have a seat at the table, and really appreciate, Joel, your input on that, but also the regulatory agencies such as Army Corps and DEP or perhaps SwiftMud on that side for state. That is certainly critical to this discussion. If this is to advance anywhere with that, we need to kind of establish some train of thought and buy-in on that. And actually, Mark, if you're still on, I'd love to kind of pose a question to you in that regard, that because I know that you do comment on some of these projects that move forward. In Tom's example with looking at benefits that are essentially off-site from where a project may occur in his port example, and restoring something like the hydrology that could benefit the multitude of acres at rock ponds versus perhaps a direct impact to, a different resource. If you had a seagrass impact at the port, but you could contribute in the overall, as part of the overall mitigation, to a larger ecological benefit of the hydrologic restoration at rock ponds. That's something I'd love to hear your comments on. Just, that's not a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 general mitigation, the like for like. If seagrass impact is seagrass mitigation, but what if under this new system or scheme there was seagrass impact and, yes, some seagrass restoration, but also contribution to a larger mosaic of benefit or habitat restoration. Just curious on your comments on that.
Sure. Would you like me to answer that now?
I'd love it.
Okay. We were doing multiple speakers and then reply. So with regard to your comment, our agency would advocate for, certainly, and this is important, right, just to ecologically offset what the resource is that's being impacted. That being said, if there are additional ecological services such as mangrove or tidal marsh restoration that could be accomplished in addition to seagrass restoration activities, we would certainly be an advocate for that. I do want to caution, however, that I wouldn't say that it's our policy. Our guidance has always been to mitigate for seagrass or respective habitat impacts in kind. In other words, if there are seagrass impacts, our preference is to mitigate with seagrass mitigation, because that provides the same in-house ecological services, say, as compared to tidal marsh or mangroves. However, being said that, if you have a project that could also, through hydrological improvements or scrape down or any number of activities that would also benefit additional tidal wetlands, we would consider that as well. And I think that would, no pun intended, be flushed out as part of the UMAM or Unified Mitigation Assessment Method as part of the scaling approach, which is used in again, kind of scaling projects or project impacts versus what the ecological lift should be for those projects. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just looking for your take on that. I know you've seen plenty of these projects come across your desk. So appreciate your input.
Right, and I want to add right into that. There was no intent by this made-up example to think that just getting water quality would mitigate for seagrass impacts. I know the agencies want type for type, and we should always strive for type for type. So in that mitigation example, they would have to, if they had seagrass impacts, they need to do that in their mitigation. But while they're doing that, if they connected it and had better water flow to these open water areas that swim put in, we may get seagrasses in there. Either way, it's going to improve that scoring. It's just a UMAM score, so you get maybe one click higher in that score, but we still want type for type. It just provides a secondary benefit to this restoration project from this made-up example, right? So the intent was never to say, hey, we can do so much water quality improvement somewhere else that we don't have to do mitigation for our seagrass impact. We want that baseline at least 1-to-1. I know we're not living in ratios anymore, but in my mind, at least 1-to-1 for the impacts. And then put it through UMAM, so it might be higher or lower. But then anything additional they can do that improves an area that we need to get improved or provides critical habitat. That's what I was trying to get to.
Appreciate that, Tom. Let me jump in on that real quick if I could. Again, what the intent of mitigation should be is to offset the lost ecological services for perpetuity from a project, that's occurred at the present time. And to your comment about 1-to-1 ratio, working with our agency, who now uses UMAM in the federal permitting arena along with DEP, various mitigation projects that have been successful, we found, not looking at ratios, but if you do look at what the return on investment is, for lack of a better term, it actually comes out closer to 2-to-1. And that's our preference, just to provide for oftentimes the lost ecological interim services, if you will, between the project impact time and by the time those habitats are restored and reach success as to what the level of resources were at the impact site, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Will has his hand up.
Hey Tom, how you doing?
Good. Thanks.
I put in one concept, or a thought about as you're speaking about mitigation. I kind of put my comment in there, but something else I've tried to pitch in the past, and it really gets no traction. There's still a lot of agriculture that occurs in this region of the edge of Tampa Bay, and I've always had the thought of, if we could identify ag lands interior to the county that were for sale, and an entity purchased that piece and swapped it for conservation designation of an area of ag lands that are in this critical zone, even if we're giving them more acres for what we deem to be more valuable acres. I would like to see some entity at least taking that into consideration. And and I'm sorry, Jamie, I was supposed to say I'm from the district, but I don't think we've ever really fleshed that out. Is there a way to have a beneficial trade of acreage for land that we deem to be more valuable if all the landowner really is interested in is an agricultural opportunity? And I'll leave that there.
I would love to see that, Will, because I think that would help get our reservation areas that we have in our plan to get these areas tied up so they don't sprout houses and then pinch out our coastal wetlands as sea level rises. So I think that would be good. That'd be a little bit tougher cookie as far as getting the regulatory agencies to count that as mitigation. But I'm open to it. I'm open to any ideas, whether it's a combination of we'll buy this land over here, put a conservation easement over it. We're also going to create some wetlands because there's no mitigation bank here, and we're going to do this in a spot that happens to be next to a preserve, so they get a little bit extra lift and maybe help that preserve out a little bit. I love these ideas. I think, what we need to do is see who has immediate upcoming needs and don't have good solutions, and then pull the regulatory agencies in and see what we can come up with that's beneficial. And these are tough. These are a house of cards, right? It just takes one card to pull it and drop everything. But I know if we try, we will be able to get one or two projects that actually meet this goal, and I think it's a win-win.
Part of the point is that the low-bearing fruit's been picked, and these things are going to continually get more difficult. And I don't think they're going to be approached from traditional approaches. I think what was available through traditional approaches has occurred, and we're going to have to start the complexities going up on many different fronts. And these are the types of things that if there's still some victories to be had out there, and I think there are, that we may need to start looking at this a little different. Thank you.
Agreed. Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Okay, so it sounds like I think we're going to have to continue this conversation. I would say we have a lot of interest. So Tom, maybe me, you, Jessica, and Doug can, continue some of this conversation after the meeting and come up with some of the next steps, and whether that's formally part of the HRC or in some sort of other fashion, we'll come up with that. But I do want to give, Jessica has somebody that wanted to give us a quick update on a project. Was that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say during the open discussion portion here, if there's anyone that wants to share generally just some awesome projects that they're working on or that are coming up and you'd like some feedback on. And I did ask Sherry from Manatee County here to give an update. So Sherry, if you want to go ahead and give a quick update, but also anyone else should feel free to jump in with updates or questions as well.
Sure. I turned on my camera, but I may be having slight connectivity issues. So if I start to tap out, let me know and I'll turn it off. Am I sharing my screen?
I can share your presentation if you want to. Let me
get
that going.
I updated it. So is that the one I sent you? Or?
I can give you permission real quick, Sherry.
Yeah. So while she does that,
all right,
my
you should have permission now.
Yeah. All right, good. Looks like it worked.
Yeah, might be loading. I don't see it yet, but yeah, I see it now.
All right, thanks. Well, as Jessica mentioned, my name is Sherry Swanson. I am the Ecological and Marine Resources Division Manager with Manatee County Natural Resources. Jessica invited me today to the HRC to give a brief overview and update on Manatee County's oyster restoration efforts for the Manatee River, which you should see on your screen. I've been with Manatee County about 6 months, during which time I'm learning a lot, and I have been picking up and carrying forward and expanding upon work that was started by my predecessor, Damon Moore, who's on this call, I think still. I saw his name. So the map you see in front of us was created. Damon, in his new role with ESA, created this map, and this map sort of highlights, it was sort of geared towards kind of giving us a high-level roadmap of some areas we might be able to target. Oh, sorry, I was reading the chat. Some of the areas that we might be looking to target. This particular map was made looking to possibly permit oyster restoration using the FDAC's aquaculture restoration, which is their Rule 1821. And the yellow on this map represents some of the setbacks that represents areas looking at some of the setbacks that FDACS requires. And interestingly, this map ended up giving approximately a little over 600 acres of potential area. Now, obviously, we'd have to get out in the field and do a lot more in-water surveys to see if there were seagrasses and such. But this was sort of promising, and it kind of helped us hone in some areas that we might start targeting for these projects. So the next slide I'm just going to show gives, I guess I can, sorry. The next slide kind of gives an overview of what we have going, trying to kind of get everything organized, and we have a variety of grants coming online and funding opportunities that were started before I came, some of which I've been working on since I've come. So I'm trying to sort of get it all lined out. But one of the first ones that may be coming up is the restore money that we got for oyster restoration. That still has some scoping, legal, and Board of County Commissioner reviews to happen, but hoping that we'll be getting that money ready to go early next year at the latest. You may or may not have heard, we got appropriation money through FDEP. We're waiting to be assigned a grant manager for that. That appropriation money gave Manatee County money to do master planning, which sort of has been started by looking at the map on the previous slide, but then just drilling down further and coming up with a plan of attack to get as much oyster restoration in the river as possible. As part of that funding, we also have partners, GSI, Gulf Shellfish Institute, that for doing research, Sarasota Baywatch with a clam focus, and START, which will be helping us resume our recycled oyster program at Robinson Preserve, which will hopefully help us do some of these projects. We are currently in the final stretch of FWC grant funding. We're developing the budget now. That has been made possible through matching funds with Manatee Fish and Game Association and Coastal Conservation Association, as well as Manatee County staff who are really stepping up, and we're going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting to make this project happen. In this project, we're permitting restoration east of 41 to build hopefully a 2.2 acre area, but we're also hoping to use the FDAX permitting to permit another larger area, and I'll go back to the map, hopefully perhaps near the Braden River, to have, we won't be able to build it with the funding because it's not enough, but we're hoping to have a shovel-ready area to install oysters once additional funding becomes available. As I mentioned, we're with the FWC funding, and this may be the first project possibly that we get underway, perhaps as soon as spring, summer 2024. That will be 0.2 acre area, but we've also already applied for funding to hopefully build the additional areas we get permitted through that grant. And then basically we have been working with a lot of people, Damon prior to me, and we continue to do so. We started a Manatee River Oyster Restoration Working Group. That's including lots of people who have great experience with this, including NOAA, the NEPs, Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, even our USF IFIS and our staff. We've also been having some really exciting conversations with FWRI about different fish monitoring that we would like to do on these reefs, not just around the reef with seine nets, but also with lift nets over the reefs to see what resident species might be using the reefs. So we're really excited about that component. GSI is one of our partners that they're going to be having funding associated with restore money, but also the FDEP appropriation funding. And they're also interested in some fish monitoring components as well as clams, oysters, seagrass, and mangroves. As I mentioned before, we're working with START. We're really hoping to ramp back up the recycled oyster program because we know we're going to need a lot of oyster shell for these projects, and that seems to be a big expense on these projects. And then lastly, there are some other projects that are related. The City of Bradenton, as you know, they're going to be, I believe, working on an oyster restoration project also in the Manatee River. Manatee County Board of County Commissioners just approved $500,000 to go to all clams on deck, kind of filtered through GSI, just adding on to their research for clams, seagrass, oysters, and mangroves. And then Manatee County has several living shorelines going on, which will inevitably have a component of oysters as well. So I guess one of the things Jessica suggested for me coming here is that there are a lot of great minds on this call, and we're just starting to, through our working group, we're trying to tackle some of the bigger issues, if you will, or things that are components of these projects. So I just made this quick slide to kind of, construction is expensive, materials may be hard to find. We're already actively looking at ways to leverage funding to build these reefs. We've been talking with folks about standardizing monitoring, including adding fisheries monitoring to these reefs. And then we'll probably be doing a couple permitting approaches. I mean, FDACS is what we're going to be hopefully doing out the gate. But with the FDACS, one of the things with that is most of these reefs are probably going to be subtidal. And I know we'll want to also have intertidal reefs. So we may have to do a couple of different permitting approaches in order to achieve that. And then lastly, climate change is definitely going to be something to consider, particularly with subtidal reefs. They're just going to get deeper, but also with mangroves, perhaps taking over these reefs when we build them. So we have a lot of things to consider. And with that, I will stop talking. Thank you for the opportunity to give an overview of this cool project.
Cool, thank you, Sherry. That's awesome. A lot of great work being done. If anyone has input for Sherry or wants to follow up with her, Sherry, maybe you can drop your contact info into the chat.
Sure.
But also, if there are any announcements or other awesome projects that y'all are working on that you want others to know about or you want some feedback on, feel free to pipe up for that now and potentially suggest it as a suggestion for the next meeting. And Jamie, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Jessica. Yep, just if anybody has anything, do we have a hand raised? Hold on. Oh, no, just kidding. Chris Kaufman, are you stretching or raising your hand?
Nope, thank you. I was raising my hand.
Sorry.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Kaufman from Noah's Restoration Center. Sorry, I have poor internet connection, so there's probably a bit of a delay. But I did want to share with everybody a funding opportunity that we have currently open. It'll only be open for another few days. It closes September 6th. It's Transformational Habitat Restoration and Resiliency Grant. We are offering $85 million nationwide as a competitive habitat restoration grant. You can ask us for $1 million to up to $15 million. And I know it's a little late in the game to be applying if you haven't started already, but I did want to share this because we will be offering it again, I think annually. The plan is to offer this annually over the next 4 years. So it'll be about roughly $85 million every year for the next 4 years. And another opportunity, if you have interest in working with and within underserved communities in the Tampa Bay area, we also have a separate funding opportunity to do habitat restoration planning or restoration actions. And that grant is not due until October 5th of this year, and you can request $75,000 up to $1 million for those projects. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to drop my email address in the chat box. Please connect with me. I'm available year-round to help you develop projects. I've already bothered Sherry about this, and so when her busy schedule dies down, maybe we'll get to connect on our grant opportunities. But this is open to anybody and everybody. And so I will leave my information and some links in the chat box for you.
Thanks so much, Chris. That sounds like a lot of potential there. And yeah, I think you already saw Doug's asking for the links if you're able to provide those. All right. Anybody else have anything that they want to share? If not, please feel free, if you think of something after the fact, you can get in touch with me, Doug, or Jessica. We're always open to ideas for next topics. If anybody has ongoing projects, lessons learned, anything, this is a club for everyone. So otherwise, I do want to say thank you all very much for attending today. We made it up to 43 people, so I'm pretty happy about that. And I see Brandon has something to say. Go ahead, Brandon.
Hey, I was just gonna, Barb Stalvard with the City of St. Pete had asked me to give an update on the Maximo Park Living Shoreline, but I think in the interest of time, it might be best to kick that to the next meeting, and hopefully Barb can join there. I have a couple of slides, but I saw Tom Reese had to drop off. Stantec and ESA are working on that together with the City of St. Pete. So looks like we might be running out of time. So maybe just put that on the topic for next time. And if Barb isn't able to attend, I'll make sure that I have get you the slides ahead of time.
Okay. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, if anybody has updates for other projects, I think this is the format, the venue to share them. So, we all love looking at nice pictures of successful restoration projects. And even if they're not successful, those are lessons learned. Please share them so we don't do that again. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you to our presenters. And Doug or Jessica, do you have anything else?
We do have our. Go ahead, Doug.
I just want to thank everybody for participating. This is, kind of a new organization that's gaining some momentum. So we hope to keep building interesting agendas and bringing new topics to the group. It's sort of modeled after the Nitrogen Management Consortium, but with much different objectives. But we want to get to a point where this is a lively discussion with informative topics and a lot of participation from the great stakeholders in the TVEP program area. So, Jessica, can you talk about the next date for the next meeting?
Read my mind, Doug. Our next meeting is December 14th. That's another Wednesday, same time, 1:30 to 3:30. It is on the TVEP calendar, and I'll send out a reminder a few weeks before that, but go ahead and put it down on your calendar now. And that's all I was going to say earlier too, Jamie, so
Okay.
I'm good.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. And if for some reason you don't believe that you're on Jessica's email list, please reach out to her so we can get you added so you're not missing any updates. And otherwise, next time, bring a friend. Thanks.
Thanks, y'all.
Have a great day.
Hey, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Jessica, yeah, did you